How would you define leadership success? Fame? Recognition? A book deal? For Barnabas, these leadership benchmarks never came to fruition. As far as we know, he wrote none of the New Testament. In other words, he had no book deal. In the book of Acts, Luke provided only 5 vignettes of Barnabas' life, so he received very little fame. And just about every time we see Barnabas approaching the stage to be recognized, Paul grabs the mic and receives the glory. Therefore, he received no recognition. So what was his legacy? In sports, we honor great players and great coaches. But who remembers the guy who was really good at helping others succeed? We seldom read about a starting quarterback whose greatest legacy was developing the second string guy. Dr. Thomas writes, "For Christian leadership to be successful, it must be successive." In Barnabas, who is quite possibly one of the most vital influencers in the early church's mission to the Gentiles, we see a man whose greatest legacy is in those whom he developed. Barnabas valued developing leaders. Dr. Howe writes, "His influence far outweighs his coverage." 14 of the 27 books of the New Testament were written by men helped on their way by Barnabas. So who was he? What do we know? According to Acts 4:36, we see that his real name was Joseph. He was a native of Cyprus, and he was a Jew, specifically a Levite. Was he a leader? And if so, what can we learn from his leadership? If leadership is influence, then Barnabas left an incredible legacy. There are many leadership principles that one could glean from his life. Let's look at 2 of them. First, leaders are generous encouragers. Barnabas was a great encourager. In fact, his very name is a testimony to that fact. In Acts 4, we're introduced to Barnabas. Verse 36 says, "Thus Joseph, who was also called by the apostles Barnabas," which means son of encouragement. The name Barnabas was not even his real name, but was given to him by the apostles because of his practice of encouraging others. Here, in this text, we see him selling his field and generously giving the money to the apostles. Later in Acts chapter 9, we see him encouraging Paul, the former persecutor and recent convert. Even when all of the other disciples were scared to be around Paul, Barnabas was there. Barnabas was a generous encourager. His very name is a testament to that fact. Leaders would do well to adopt his habit of generous encouragement. Number 2, Barnabas was a humble mentor. Acts chapter 11 tells us the story of what was happening in Antioch. Verse 22 says, "The report came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas there. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord." Barnabas was sent out by the Jerusalem church to a developing church in Antioch, where he had tremendous success. Verse 24 says, "Many people were added to the Lord." This was Barnabas' moment. He had arrived. He was the starting quarterback on a winning team. But notice what he does next. Verse 25 says, "So Barnabas went to Tarshish to look for Saul. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year they met with the church and taught a great many people." Barnabas went to recruit Saul. It's as if Barnabas, the starting quarterback, became instrumental in the draft and recruited a backup quarterback. Who does this? In Acts 13, verse 1, we're introduced to Barnabas' team. Verse 1 says, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." The leadership team of 5 in Antioch was led by Barnabas. Saul was perhaps the youngest member since he was mentioned last. Verse 2 says, "While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, 'Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them.' Then after fasting and praying, they laid hands on them and sent them off." Dr. Howe writes, "Barnabas demonstrated his selfless character by leaving the promising work in Antioch, where he was the recognized leader, to undertake a difficult pioneering work in Cyprus and Galatia." In verse 13 of that same chapter, it happens. Paul, the backup, takes over as the starting quarterback. Notice the change. Now Paul and his companions set sail for Paphos. Up to this point, Barnabas was named first in Luke's account. And here in this verse, notice Barnabas is not even named, but is listed with Paul's companions. Barnabas, the leader, has become Barnabas, the facilitator. We see in the life of Barnabas the incredible power of the servant leader, who facilitates the success of others. John Piper writes of these types of leaders, they have the beautiful gift of fading into the background while pushing others into prominence. They are not addicted to the praise of men and do not crave the limelight. Barnabas, whose own personality and gifting would before long be eclipsed by his younger co-worker Saul, had the humility to place the welfare of the work above his individual standing. Barnabas was an incredibly humble mentor, not only of Paul, but later he will develop another mentee named John Mark. These two men, Paul and Mark, wrote over half of the New Testament. Barnabas was not just a leader, but more importantly, he was a leader maker. His greatest legacies are those he mentored. His greatest successes are those who succeeded him. Leaders who desire a true legacy will do well to adopt Barnabas' example of humbly mentoring others. One of the most humbling things one can do in life is move to a foreign country. The most rudimentary tasks are virtually impossible. Speaking is absurd. The culture is unfamiliar. Relationships are peculiar. Before moving to Madagascar, I thought erroneously that I actually knew something. But after stepping one foot on this island, I realized I had been enrolled in preschool. It became very clear, very quickly, that what I had been used to in my pastoral experience in the States, the more upfront, holding the mic, much more Paul than Barnabas type ministry, was not only impossible, but would stifle the growth and be counterproductive. So, I took a back seat. Our ultimate goal in Madagascar is to no longer be needed in Madagascar. We want to work ourselves out of a job. And if I do not release the work into the hands of the Malagasy people, I am not doing my job. With this in mind, we began encouraging and mentoring Malagasy leaders towards that vision. Let me share a few brief stories about our version of a Malagasy Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark, whom we've had the privilege of working with. Our version of Paul, whose real name is Janiru, is a Malagasy pastor, church planter, and missionary. He has served to reach the Malagasy people for many years, planting churches, starting schools, developing social relief programs, and even living as a missionary among the Makea people of Madagascar. For the past 4 years, he has been my partner and friend. He has trained, cast vision, and pioneered new work alongside me. Recently, he has been offered a new position in charge of developing a Malagasy mission agency for the Baptist Convention. This is a major step in the health of the Malagasy Church. I have no doubt that Janiru will eclipse my influence through his work. I simply have the privilege of coming alongside this Malagasy Paul and encouraging him in the ministry. Manatusua is my Malagasy pastor. Originally, he tutored me in the Masakuru dialect. We began taking trips to the bush together in an attempt to learn language and culture, but these trips quickly took on a new purpose as we saw the lostness among the people. Manatusua caught the vision for reaching the Malagasy people and began training and challenging his church to work in the harvest. He is now leading a group of churches to pool their resources each week to send Malagasy missionaries out to the bush. In many ways, Manatusua is himself a Barnabas. He does an excellent job of encouraging and mentoring others. His legacy will truly be in those whom he has mentored. When I first met Zisafi, he looked petrified. He was a bush pastor of a small congregation and was so insecure that he didn't even believe he was qualified to baptize others. When I shared with him the vision for reaching the Masakura people, he was overwhelmed. He had no idea how this could be done. Over the next few years, our team began mentoring him, and now, not only has he baptized many new believers, but is becoming a church planting catalyst in the Masakura region. While he may have believed he was useless, much like how John Mark became useful to Paul, he is becoming invaluable to God's work in Madagascar.